Denzel Washington was about to say 9 words that would expose a secret Whoopi Goldberg had been hiding for 30 years. But neither of them knew it was coming. She had just delivered what she believed was her most devastating blow, a calculated question designed to humiliate a man she thought she could break. A man of unshakable faith, quiet strength, and steel resolve. The cameras were rolling live across America. 2.8 million viewers were watching. Whoopi was certain she had him cornered, ready to make him look foolish in front of the entire nation. But what Denzel said next didn't just silence her. It shattered the mask she'd been wearing her entire career. What were those 9 words that left Whoopi Goldberg speechless for the first time in television history? What could this Academy Award-winning actor possibly say that would make ABC executives panic and cut to commercial break? What secret had Whoopi been hiding that even her closest friends didn't know? This is the story of the most explosive confrontation in daytime television history, when a man who never backs down from truth met a woman who had spent decades running from it. It all began when Whoopi made the fatal mistake of challenging the wrong man about the wrong subject on live television. But here's what nobody knew. 3 days before this interview, Denzel had received a phone call that changed everything. A phone call that revealed something about Whoopi's past that she thought was buried forever. Something that would explain why she fought so hard against faith, why she mocked believers with such intensity, and why his 9 words would hit her like a lightning bolt straight to the soul. The truth was about to come out, and millions of people were about to witness a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The confrontation that was about to unfold would do more than just shock viewers. It would expose a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. If Denzel hadn't walked onto that stage that morning, if he hadn't received that mysterious phone call 3 days earlier, Whoopi Goldberg might have taken her deepest secret to the grave. A secret that explained everything about her public persona, her relentless attacks on faith, and her desperate need to convince the world that believing in something greater was foolish. But this wasn't just about one woman's hidden pain. Millions of viewers had been watching Whoopi for years, trusting her voice, following her lead, believing that her mockery of faith was justified. They had no idea they were listening to someone who wasn't speaking from wisdom, but from a wound so deep it had shaped her entire worldview. If this moment hadn't happened, if Denzel hadn't been brave enough to speak those 9 words, countless people would have continued down a path of spiritual emptiness, never knowing they were being led by someone who was running from the very thing they needed most. The stakes were higher than anyone realized. This wasn't just daytime television drama. This was about truth versus performance, authentic faith versus manufactured skepticism, and the power of 9 words to change not just one life, but potentially millions. What was about to happen would prove that sometimes the people who fight hardest against hope are the ones who need it most desperately. 3 days before the interview that would change everything, Denzel Washington sat in his quiet study in Mount Vernon, New York, surrounded by the things that mattered most to him. Not awards or accolades, but family photos, a well-worn Bible his grandmother had given him, and handwritten letters from people whose lives had been touched by his faith. The morning sunlight streamed through the window as he read from the Book of Psalms, a daily ritual that had anchored him for decades. That's when his phone rang with a call that would reveal a secret nobody saw coming. The voice on the other end belonged to someone unexpected. Not a producer or publicist, but Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatric oncologist from Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. Her voice was shaking as she spoke. "Mr. Washington, I need to tell you something about Whoopi Goldberg that I think you should know before your interview tomorrow. Something that happened 30 years ago that she's never talked about publicly." Dr. Chen had been following Whoopi's increasingly hostile comments about faith and felt compelled to reach out. What she was about to reveal would explain everything about Whoopi's anger, her pain, and her desperate need to convince the world that hope was foolish. Dr. Chen's words hit Denzel like a revelation. 30 years ago, Whoopi had spent 3 months visiting the children's cancer ward at Mount Sinai, not for cameras or publicity, but because she had made a promise to someone she loved. Someone whose final wish was for Whoopi to find the faith that had sustained them through their darkest hour. But instead of finding peace, Whoopi had experienced something that shattered her trust in everything she once believed. She had been carrying this pain for 3 decades, and it had shaped every public statement she'd made about faith since then. As Dr. Chen finished her story, Denzel understood that tomorrow's interview wasn't just about promoting his new film. It was about healing a wound that had been festering for 30 years. That evening, Denzel didn't prepare for the interview the way most celebrities would. There were no talking points, no rehearsed answers, no strategic planning sessions with publicists. Instead, he spent hours in prayer, asking for wisdom and the right words to reach a woman who had been running from healing for 3 decades. He pulled out old newspaper clippings from 30 years ago, articles about a young comedian named Whoopi Goldberg who had quietly spent her summer visiting sick children, bringing laughter to the darkest places. The woman in those photos looked different from the hardened skeptic the world knew today. Her eyes held hope then, not the bitter cynicism that had become her trademark. Dr. Chen had told him about Maria, Whoopi's closest friend and the person who had made that final request. Maria had been diagnosed with terminal cancer at age 34, leaving behind a young daughter and a broken heart. In her final weeks, Maria had found profound peace through her faith, and she had begged Whoopi to seek that same peace. She had made Whoopi promise to visit the children's ward, to see how faith sustained families through impossible circumstances. But something had gone wrong during those visits. Something had happened that turned Whoopi's search for faith into a bitter rejection of everything Maria had believed in. Denzel understood now why Whoopi fought so hard against believers. She wasn't just rejecting faith, she was rejecting the memory of her best friend's dying wish. Every time she mocked prayer, every time she dismissed hope, she was protecting herself from the guilt of breaking a promise to someone she loved. The anger wasn't really about God or religion. It was about grief, disappointment, and a woman who had convinced herself that cynicism was safer than hope. As Denzel prepared for what he knew would be the most important conversation of his career, he prayed not for victory, but for the right words to help a wounded soul find the healing she had been running from for 30 years. The next morning, Denzel arrived at the View Studios in Manhattan carrying something unexpected. Not the usual stack of promotional materials or prepared talking points, but a small, weathered envelope that Dr. Chen had given him the night before. Inside was a letter that Maria had written to Whoopi just days before her death, a letter that had never been delivered. The hospital had kept it all these years, and Dr. Chen had finally decided it was time for Whoopi to read her friend's final words. But Denzel knew he couldn't just hand over the letter. The timing had to be perfect, the moment had to be right, or it would shatter rather than heal. As he walked through the bustling studio, Denzel observed the controlled chaos of live television. Producers rushed between sets, makeup artists made final touch-ups, and the audience filed into their seats, eager for the entertainment they expected from daytime TV. But what they were about to witness would be far more powerful than entertainment. In the green room, Denzel sat quietly, the letter tucked safely in his jacket pocket, while other guests chatted nervously about their upcoming segments. He watched Whoopi through the monitor as she prepared for the show, her usual confident demeanor masking the pain that only he now understood. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman who had built her career on being fearlessly honest, yet she had been hiding the most important truth of her life for 30 years. She had become famous for her quick wit and sharp tongue, but her sharpest words were reserved for the very thing her dying friend had begged her to embrace. As the minutes ticked by before his segment, Denzel felt the weight of what he was about to do. He wasn't just going on television to promote a film. He was about to help a woman confront the promise she had broken and the friend she had disappointed, all while millions of people watched. The letter in his pocket felt heavier than any Oscar he had ever held. When Denzel's name was announced, he walked onto the View set with the quiet confidence that had made him a legend, but there was something different in his eyes today. Something deeper, more purposeful. The audience applauded warmly as he took his seat, but Whoopi's greeting was cooler than usual. She had heard about his recent interviews where he'd spoken openly about his faith, and she was already preparing her arsenal of questions designed to expose what she saw as intellectual weakness. What she didn't know was that Denzel had spent the entire morning praying for her, not preparing to defend himself. The conversation started pleasantly enough. They discussed his latest film, his family, his decades-long career. But Whoopi was just warming up, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her co-host sensed the shift when she leaned forward with that familiar look in her eyes, the one that appeared whenever she was about to challenge someone's beliefs. "Now Denzel," she said with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, "you've been very vocal about your faith lately. Help me understand something. How does an intelligent, educated man like yourself still believe in what are essentially ancient fairy tales?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. They had seen Whoopi dismantle religious guests before, and they expected Denzel to either back down or get defensive. But instead, he did something unexpected. He smiled gently and said, "Whoopi, before I answer that, can I ask you something? What happened 30 years ago that made you so angry at God?" The question landed like a thunderbolt. Whoopi's confident expression flickered for just a moment, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. She had been ready for a theological debate, not a personal conversation about her past. The silence stretched for several seconds, live television time that felt like an eternity. Whoopi's co-hosts exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. The audience held its breath. Finally, Whoopi regained her composure and let out a forced laugh. "I'm not angry at anything, Denzel. I just don't believe in fairy tales." But her voice carried a tremor that careful viewers would notice. Denzel nodded slowly, his eyes filled with compassion rather than judgment. "I understand," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's easier to reject something than to face the disappointment of hoping for it." Those words hit closer to home than Whoopi was prepared for, and the real confrontation was just beginning. Whoopi's forced laugh grew louder, more desperate. She was trying to regain control of the interview, but Denzel's gentle persistence was unraveling her carefully constructed armor. "Disappointment?" she said, her voice rising slightly. "Denzel, I'm not disappointed. I'm realistic. I don't need imaginary friends to get through life." But even as she spoke, her hands betrayed her, fidgeting with her cards in a way that regular viewers had never seen before. Her co-hosts tried to help by changing the subject, but Denzel's compassionate gaze never left Whoopi's face. "You know what I think is really fairy tale thinking?" Whoopi continued, her voice getting sharper. "Believing that some invisible force cares about your problems. Believing that prayer actually changes anything. I've seen too much pain, too much suffering to buy into that fantasy." She was trying to sound confident, but there was something raw in her voice now, something that spoke of personal experience rather than philosophical disagreement. The audience was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something far more intimate than a typical daytime TV debate. Denzel leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm and gentle. "Whoopi, you're not talking about faith in general. You're talking about something specific that happened to you. Something that broke your heart so deeply that you've spent 30 years running from it." The words hit their mark. Whoopi's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice cracked just slightly. "I'm not running from anything. I'm just not gullible enough to believe in magic. But Denzel wasn't backing down. I know about Maria, he said quietly, and the effect was immediate. Whoopi went completely still, her face draining of color. The name hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Her co-hosts looked confused, but Whoopi knew exactly what he meant. For the first time in the interview, she was speechless, staring at Denzel with a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like terror. The secret she had guarded for 30 years was about to be exposed on live television. The studio fell into an eerie silence. Whoopi's usual quick wit had completely abandoned her. She sat frozen, staring at Denzel as if he had just spoken the name of a ghost. The cameras captured every micro-expression on her face, the shock, the fear, the pain that she had hidden for 3 decades. Her co-hosts exchanged worried glances, completely lost. They had no idea who Maria was or why that single name had the power to silence the most outspoken woman in daytime television. "How do you know that name?" Whoopi whispered, her voice barely audible through the studio microphones. All her bravado was gone, replaced by the vulnerability of someone whose deepest secret had just been exposed. Denzel reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and gentle. "Because someone who cares about you thought it was time," he said softly. "Time for you to read the letter Maria wrote to you before she died. The letter you never got to see." The revelation hit the studio like a lightning bolt. Whoopi's eyes went wide as Denzel pulled out the weathered envelope, holding it carefully as if it contained something precious and fragile. Which, in many ways, it did. For 30 years, Whoopi had believed that her friend Maria had died disappointed in her, thinking that Whoopi had abandoned her faith and broken her promise. But the truth was more complex, more beautiful, and more healing than she had ever imagined. "Maria never stopped believing in you," Denzel said, his voice filled with gentle authority. "Even when you thought you had failed her, even when you convinced yourself that her faith was meaningless, she knew something about your heart that you forgot. She knew that your anger wasn't really about God. It was about love. About losing someone so important that you couldn't bear to hope for anything that's significant again." The words hung in the air like a bridge between 30 years of pain and the possibility of healing. Whoopi's hands trembled as she stared at the letter, her entire worldview about to be turned upside down. With shaking hands, Whoopi reached for the letter, but then pulled back as if it might burn her. "I can't," she whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I can't read it. Not here. Not now." But Denzel's voice was gentle yet insistent. "Whoopi, you've been carrying this pain for 30 years. Maria's words aren't going to hurt you. They're going to heal you." The audience watched in stunned silence as one of television's strongest personalities began to crumble before their eyes. This wasn't the confident, sharp-tongued woman they knew. This was someone who had been broken long ago and had never allowed herself to heal. "You don't understand," Whoopi said, her voice breaking. "I promised her I would find faith. I promised her I would visit those children and learn from their hope. But when I got there, when I saw those babies suffering, when I watched their parents praying for miracles that never came." Her voice trailed off as tears began to fall. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend to believe in something that would let innocent children suffer. I broke my promise to her. I disappointed my best friend when she needed me most." The confession hung in the air like a sacred moment. For the first time, America was seeing the real reason behind Whoopi's hostility toward faith. It wasn't intellectual superiority or philosophical disagreement. It was guilt, grief, and the crushing weight of feeling like she had failed someone she loved. Denzel's eyes filled with compassion as he watched this proud woman finally expose the wound that had been festering for 3 decades. "Whoopi," he said softly, "what if I told you that Maria knew? What if she understood exactly why you couldn't find faith the way she did? What if her final letter wasn't about disappointment, but about understanding? About forgiveness? About a love that was bigger than your doubts? He held up the letter again, this time more insistently. The woman who wrote this letter wasn't angry at you. She was grateful for you. She was proud of you. And she had something to tell you about faith that you never heard. The tears were flowing freely now, and Whoopi was no longer trying to hide them. The mask had completely fallen away, and what remained was a woman who had been running from healing for far too long. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the cameras. Whoopi sat there, tears streaming down her face, staring at the letter that contained her best friend's final words. The audience held its breath as Denzel extended the envelope toward her once more. "Whoopi," he said with infinite gentleness, "you've spent 30 years punishing yourself for something Maria never wanted you to feel guilty about. Don't you think it's time to hear what she really wanted to tell you?" Whoopi's hands trembled as she finally took the letter. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What if it's worse than I thought? What if she really was disappointed in me? What if reading this breaks me completely?" The vulnerability in her voice was heartbreaking. Here was a woman who had built her career on being unbreakable, admitting that she was terrified of the truth. Denzel leaned forward, his voice filled with quiet authority. "Whoopi, I'm going to tell you something that might change everything. Maria didn't write this letter because she was disappointed in you. She wrote it because she saw something in you that you couldn't see in yourself. She saw your heart, your capacity for love, your ability to feel pain so deeply because you care so much. She knew that someone who could hurt that much about suffering children wasn't someone without faith. You were someone whose faith was so strong that you couldn't bear to see it tested." The words hit Whoopi like a revelation. Her eyes widened as she looked up at Denzel, seeing him clearly for the first time in the interview. "You're saying that my doubts, my anger, that came from caring too much, not too little?" Her voice was filled with wonder and disbelief. Denzel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And that's exactly what Maria understood. The question is, are you brave enough to let her tell you that herself?" He gestured to the letter in her hands. "Are you ready to hear what your best friend really thought about your heart?" With shaking hands, Whoopi opened the letter. As her eyes scanned Maria's handwriting, her expression transformed from fear to wonder to overwhelming relief. "She says..." Whoopi's voice broke as she read aloud, "She says she was never disappointed in me. She says my questions, my struggles, my inability to find easy answers, that was exactly what she loved about me. She says I didn't break my promise because my promise was never to find faith the way she did. It was to be honest about what I found." Tears poured down Whoopi's cheeks as she continued reading. "She says the children I visited weren't looking for someone with perfect faith. They were looking for someone who would sit with them in their questions, someone who would cry with them, someone who wouldn't pretend their pain didn't matter. She says I gave them exactly what they needed, not false hope, but real love." The studio was completely silent except for the sound of Whoopi's emotional reading. When she finished, she looked up at Denzel with new eyes. "All these years, I thought I had failed her. But she's telling me that my broken heart was exactly what those children needed. That my doubt was actually a form of caring." Denzel smiled gently. "Whoopi, can I tell you something? Your friend Maria was right. And I think it's time you heard the 9 words that explain everything about who you really are." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "Your broken heart proves you still believe in love." The words landed like healing balm on a 30-year wound. Whoopi sat speechless, finally understanding that her pain had never been evidence of lost faith. It had been evidence of a heart that loved so deeply it couldn't bear to see suffering without crying out against it. The show ended in unprecedented silence. No closing music, no final comments, just the sound of Whoopi quietly folding Maria's letter and placing it close to her heart. The audience sat in stunned reverence, having witnessed something far more powerful than entertainment. They had seen a soul find healing on live television. In the days following the interview, something remarkable happened. Whoopi didn't make any grand announcements or dramatic declarations. Instead, she quietly began visiting children's hospitals again, not as a celebrity making appearances, but as someone who understood that questions and tears were just as valuable as answers and smiles. She would sit with families, hold their hands, and say, "It's okay to be angry. It's okay to have questions. That doesn't mean you love any less." The interview clip went viral, but not for the reasons most clips do. People weren't sharing it for entertainment or controversy. They were sharing it because it showed them something they desperately needed to see, that doubt and faith weren't opposites, that broken hearts could still love, and that sometimes the people who question the most are the ones who care the deepest. Most importantly, Whoopi finally understood what Maria had tried to tell her 30 years ago. Faith wasn't about having all the answers or never feeling pain. It was about loving so deeply that you couldn't help but cry out when that love was threatened. Her broken heart hadn't been evidence of lost faith, it had been evidence of a love so powerful it could move mountains, ask hard questions, and still choose to hope. So here's the question that matters most. What if, like Whoopi, you've been running from the very thing that could heal you? What if the pain you've been carrying, the questions you've been asking, the doubts you've been fighting, what if those aren't signs of weakness, but evidence of a heart that loves so deeply it can't help but care? Maybe you've been waiting for perfect faith before you take the first step. Maybe you've been thinking that your questions disqualify you from hope. But Whoopi's story proves something beautiful. God doesn't need you to have all the answers. He just needs you to have an honest heart. A heart that cares enough to hurt when others hurt. A heart that loves enough to ask hard questions. A heart that's broken enough to need healing. The same love that reached Whoopi through a 30-year-old letter is reaching for you right now. Not because you're perfect, but because you're human. Not because you have it all figured out, but because you care enough to keep searching. Your broken heart isn't evidence that you're too far gone, it's evidence that you're exactly where love can find you. If this story touched something in your heart, if you recognize yourself in Whoopi's journey, share it with someone who needs to know that their questions don't disqualify them from hope. And in the comments below, tell us, what letter from the past do you need to finally read? What healing have you been running from that might be exactly what your heart needs?